question that I get asked a lot is sort of how I got into comics. But I think a more appropriate thing to discuss is what sort of, now that I'm older, right? 29 years of age. What was it about comics? What is it about comics that intrigues me enough to keep me around? So there's two parts of that. And this is why I opened with the fact that a lot of people ask me how I got into comics, because I got into it as a youngster, just like a lot of you guys, really young kid. But my appreciation grew for comics once I had aged, once I matured. And I think one of the biggest myths, and some of it has to do with the companies themselves and how they've marketed to kids, animated shows, and so forth. But a lot of the themes that happen in the actual comics are something that you can't really understand until you've matured. As a kid, Superman flies around really strong, can shoot lasers out his eyes on occasion. And then you have Spider-Man, web slings. And that's really all that you understand as a kid, right? You understand the look, the costumes, you understand the basics of the character. But you don't understand the character itself until you actually pick up a book and you read it. And my appreciation, and even now to this day, it continues to grow as I read older material. And I look at how these characters were developed, not even just from an origin standpoint and how they got their powers, but most importantly is how they interact with other characters. And this is why continuity is something that I emphasize so much. When it comes to comic book characters, it's not just because reasons. I emphasize it, and I think it's very important because that is sort of the thing about comics. The events that pop off, the events that happen when it comes to these characters, they matter. They absolutely matter. They're important. And that has been sort of a frustration with myself, coming from myself, as well as other fans in current comic books, is that there's a lot of stuff that seems to happen that doesn't matter. It's like it's just a thing. And one-offs, alternate realities and such, those events just don't, to me, pop off as things that exist within the main continuity. Things that are often sort of, they come back to it, right? They come back to it at a later date because it wasn't important, even if you missed it. Even if it doesn't seem important at the time, it's a thing that you got to acknowledge. So as I aged and started to realize that just as a human being, same concept, things matter. One thing leads into another, sort of goes into the more political and philosophical backing that I have in terms of being a libertarian and being held accountable for my actions. And I'm always looking, even in things that I get the short end of the stick, I'm always looking to see what I could have done to better my situation, or what more so happened to lead up to this. This is the end game that I'm seeing right now. What got me to this point? And understanding that and having that perspective, making adjustments in terms of how I act to have better outcomes, sort of what I love out of the comic books, in that the events matter. Things are happening. We're seeing characters come and go. We're seeing characters continue to grow. Characters that have been around long before I was even thought about being alive. Long before my parents were even alive. And I'm just so fascinated by that. I'm so fascinated by that. And it's a shame that, and I think a lot of that's changing because you got movies like Joker. You have MCU. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, which a lot of adults are watching it. They're intrigued by it. So hopefully that myth that it's just specifically for the kids or for children. I get a lot of outsiders that suggest that, oh, you talk about comics, you're a child, and it goes to show how much of there's a disconnect. It's just a big time disconnect between outsiders and people that actually read this material. Because a lot of these, I mean, if you just read some of these books, some of the themes aren't really for children at all. And they're not really for children. And I'm not just talking about specifically like the Punishers of the world. I'm even talking about with some of the stuff that happens with Batman, and a lot of the tragic things that pop off in Gotham, a lot of things that happen with Batman and Bruce, death of the family and all of that. Like, these are themes that a lot of children, you don't want them, until they've sort of aged and been able to understand these sorts of concepts, you don't really want to introduce that to them. And this is, again, these are narratives that have been put out there decades ago. So it's a myth. It's a big time myth that they're specifically for kids. And I think if you look at it from maybe animation, which a lot of that stuff is watered down, and even me, as I'm going back to watch some of these animated shows, I'm like, yeah, this is a watered down version of this character. This character isn't really like this, or this character has a lot more to them if I actually pick up the books where they were sort of inspired by. And this is why I think that the source material is so important. And I think it's something that filmmakers who want to, and TV show producers who want to use these characters should not just completely ignore. I think and a lot of times it's the excuse is that, well, they'll hurt their reach if they do that. And that is pulled from the source material. And I 100% disagree with that. I think it'll have the opposite effect if they actually read it and actually draw some influence from it, because I think these are narratives, and I think these are stories that a lot of people can relate to. And certainly if you want to get that more mature audience, there's a lot of stuff that you can pull from that will be intriguing to those types. It doesn't have to just be your run-of-the-mill popcorn flicks that are for the family, right? These can be things that are for or geared for adults, and I'm not saying that there's not room for that. For, like, again, remember, I came into this as a youngster. I've talked about how being introduced to the Flash, that was one of the first characters that was my favorite character growing up, the Flash. And a lot of that stemmed from the fact that he was fast. I was a kid, used to beat the heck out of these kids at field day and races and stuff. I was just an athletic kid, and I appreciated that out of him. And that's how I related. That's why I thought it was always stupid that so many people, mainstream leftists for the most part, are always suggesting that you need these concepts of representation. So you have to have black versions of these characters because so is going to be inspired. And I just think it's such a crazy thing. For one, it perpetuates the concept of racism, but it limits individuals and their perspective by way of their race. But it also completely ignores the guys like myself who grew up liking the Barry Allens of the world, who aren't black, but we could find ways to relate to them in other ways. And my favorite character, arguably right now, is Batman, and my appreciation for that grows because I'm better able to assess and understand the stories that he's been a part of throughout the years. Where when I was just too young, even a little over 10 years ago, when I was still a teenager. 10 years ago I was still a teenager, but the appreciation just continues to grow as I age. Simple as that. It continues to grow as I age, and I just don't see it going anywhere but up. And a lot of it isn't just with the newer material. I get a lot out of reading old stuff. I cover a lot of new material on these pages on my page because I know a lot of people expect that from me. But it's not just that. I love to read newer stuff that I haven't read, to see what the newer, groups, people that grew up maybe on the comics that are writing some of these characters, to see where they come from and see what their spin is going to be on it, and to keep y'all in the loop on that as well. But I get a lot of reading some old material, even material that I've read and assessed as an adult, reading it again maybe 5 years later. I see different things that I didn't pick up. And the appreciation just continues to grow. It continues to grow the more I read comics, and the more I age, the more experiences that I have. And I just think it's so bogus that people have tried to limit this comic book fandom or nerddom to children. It's just such an unfair assessment to the writers who have spent decades. And a lot of that is just, I get it. Like I've said before, when you talk about DC, you talk about Marvel, a lot of it comes from their promotional schemes, and they've marketed to kids. And I'm not saying that they should stop doing that or anything like that. I think that you don't really understand the characters until you read the comics, and a lot of that stuff you can't even soak it until you're of age. Really, that's really what it ultimately boils down to. You can't really appreciate it until you mature. So that's why and how my appreciation has grown. It's completely changed in terms of why I stick around for comics in comparison to why I got into it as a kid. Thankfully, I got into it as a kid, but it's not for the same reason. Just because the person can run fast isn't enough for me. And this is why somebody like Batman, why my favorite character, I love Flash, don't get me wrong, but my favorite character kind of changed from Flash to Batman because of that. And the more I read, the more I'm able to assess, and the more I'm able to look at the different perspective. When you consider all the things that Batman has gone through and the different arcs that he's had throughout his entire existence, you just have such a bigger and a more just greater appreciation for the character as an adult in comparison to just thinking that he's Batman, a guy that's in this suit jumping around beating up bad guys. It's just a lot more to the character than that.